Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us for this webinar, From Tails to Tech, Can Abandoned Mines Be a Win-Win for Energy Security and the Environment? This event, co-hosted by SAFE and Trout Unlimited, seeks to examine the extent to which existing mine waste, which often occurs on abandoned mine lands, can contribute to the rising demand for critical minerals and materials needed for electric vehicles, clean energy, defense, and our everyday lives. I'm Abby Wolf, Vice President and Director of SAFE Center for Critical Mineral Strategy. SAFE is a nonpartisan, nonprofit, mission-driven organization that serves as a thought leader on how to diversify and create secure, sustainable supply chains for critical minerals that support the foreign and military policies of the United States, advance American competitiveness, and support our interests and values. The demand for critical minerals, materials, and components is skyrocketing. By 2050, the World Bank estimates that demand for mineral commodities like lithium and graphite will increase by almost 500%. Today, the United States remains dangerously dependent upon other countries, most notably China, for many of these critical raw materials and their subsequent processed chemical compounds. While increased government and private sector commitments are needed to electrify our modes of transportation and are necessary to help insulate ourselves from volatile oil markets and reach our climate goals, we must ensure that as we make the energy transition, that we are not overly reliant on strategic competitors for key energy resources. This is a point that has been tragically reinforced by Russia's war in Ukraine and Europe's initially limited ability to effectively respond due to their over-reliance on Russian natural gas and oil. So, how do we get the mineral commodities we desperately need? To meet the coming demand, recycling will be important, but near-term needs cannot be met through recycling alone. New mines will need to be brought online in the United States and around the world, but face long delays, an often complicated permitting process, and pushback over environmental concerns from local communities and tribal groups. Therefore, could existing mine waste on abandoned mine lands provide a silver bullet to reclaim already disturbed land while obtaining new raw materials? Today's event will hear from a number of speakers to discuss this very question. Following me, you will hear from Corey Fisher, Public Lands Policy Director for Trout Unlimited. Next, Darcy McPhee, Program Manager for the U.S. Geological Survey's Earth Resources Mapping Initiative, will update on USGS's efforts to actually locate and quantify the amount of critical minerals within existing mine waste within the United States. And finally, Corey will moderate a fantastic panel with our esteemed speakers, which include Stephen Desposito, CEO of Regeneration, Dan West, Director of Public Policy for Rivian, and Kevin Ramsey, Manager of BHP Arizona Legacy Assets. Please note, we will be taking audience questions toward the end, so please have your questions ready and put them in the chat box. While we may not be able to address all of the questions in the time allotted, please feel free to reach out to us following the end of the event for more information. With that, thank you very much for your attention, and I will turn it over to Corey for his opening remarks. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Abby, and thank you all for joining us today. It's great to see such interest in a topic that up until recently would have likely just been a few policy wonks talking to each other. So I'm hoping we can have a really good conversation here today. As Abby said, I am the Public Land Policy Director for Trout Unlimited, a nationwide grassroots conservation organization with a mission to bring together diverse interests to care for and recover rivers and streams so our children can experience the joy of wild and native trout and salmon. Trout Unlimited is comprised of about 300,000 grassroots members and supporters, and we're unique among our peers in the conservation organization arena in that we work both policy and advocacy, but we also have on-the-ground restoration coordinators working throughout the country to restore watersheds, and this includes abandoned mine reclamation specialists. And since 2004, working with state, federal, mining industry, and local partners, we've restored almost 200 miles of streams degraded by abandoned mines in 6 Western states. Critical minerals are having a moment, and for a good reason. These are the raw materials of a clean energy future. And the issues, it's raised important policy questions that are being debated as we speak right now and will be for years to come. And while some of this debate is polarizing, there's also common ground across stakeholders. And something I'm excited about is that the issue of critical minerals has helped elevate one of the worst yet least addressed pollution problems in the country, with estimates that there are tens of thousands of abandoned hard rock mines polluting the environment, and that 40% of Western headwaters are impacted by abandoned mines. It's not hyperbole to say that we have an abandoned mine crisis that desperately needs to be addressed. The scope of the problem is staggering, and communities throughout the country have long suffered under the scourge of abandoned mines. But we are making progress. The Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act created a new program, which does still need to be funded at scale, for federal agencies, states, tribes, and partners to clean up abandoned hard rock mines. And in a few moments, we're going to hear about an initiative funded in the infrastructure law to map mine waste and critical minerals. One thing I also wanted to touch on is that we're making progress on legislation that would provide conditional liability relief for qualified Good Samaritans to clean up abandoned mines without implicating Clean Water Act or CERCLA liability. Well, Good Samaritan organizations like Trout Unlimited do great work cleaning up abandoned mine. There's much more that we can do. Legislation to create a new pilot program allowing Good Samaritan to expand the scope and effectiveness of our work is one area of bipartisan agreement that we should be able to get over the finish line in this Congress. Another is robust funding for the new Hard Rock Abandoned Mine Land Fund that I mentioned as a space where I think that, again, while there's aspects of these issues that can be polarizing, there's parts that can bring stakeholders together, and cleaning up abandoned mines is one of those. So seeing a lot of these pieces come together is something I'm excited about. It can help both clean up abandoned mines and recover much needed transition minerals. And I'm excited to explore that duality and opportunity for win-wins. I don't think that there are really any one silver bullet. It's really going to take all the tools in the toolbox to shore up our supply chains for critical minerals. And really applying all of those tools onto the ground is going to get us where we need to be. But that confluence of critical minerals and abandoned mines is a place where we can make progress on both fronts, not only cleaning up the environment, but producing transition minerals and perhaps relieving pressure to open new mines in sensitive areas where conflict abounds. With that, I'll turn it over to Darcy McPhee to talk about USGS's recent efforts in this space, mapping minerals and mine waste. So Darcy?
Great, thank you, Corey. And thank you, Avi. I guess we could go ahead and share the slides. Okay, great, thank you. So hello, everybody. My name is Darcy McPhee, and I'm the program manager for the U.S. Geological Survey's Earth Mapping Resources Initiative, or Earth MRI. And I'd just like to thank Trout Unlimited and the SAFE team for giving me the opportunity to speak with you today. So before the more exciting panel presentation today, I'd like to just provide a brief overview of Earth MRI, and in particular, new mine waste efforts that have been made possible by the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. So the Earth Mapping Resources Initiative, or Earth MRI, is a component of the USGS Mineral Resources Program that was established back in 2019 as a partnership between the USGS and state geological surveys to modernize the nation's mapping, with a focus on identifying areas of the country that may have the potential to contain critical mineral resources. And the current focus of Earth MRI is on critical minerals. This nationwide mapping effort includes the collection of many different fundamental geoscience types listed here, including airborne geophysics, hyperspectral data, high-resolution LiDAR, geochemistry, detailed geologic mapping that is carried out by our state geological surveys, as well as preservation of minerals data. It also, and more recently, includes mine waste mapping, and that's what I'll say a little bit more about today. Although Earth MRI is a close partnership effort between USGS and the state geological surveys, it has expanded its partnerships beyond the state surveys to work with other federal agencies, tribes, academia, and the private sector. And the value of these fundamental earth science data sets that we're collecting through this program extends in many cases beyond critical mineral resources to other vital geoscience issues, including those related to energy, groundwater hazards, land use planning, and others. And I just say all of our data can be found on our website that's shown here on the slide. So Earth MRI uses what's known as a mineral systems approach to outline areas containing rock types associated with critical mineral bearing ore deposits. So these are areas that may have some potential for hosting critical minerals. A mineral system is a family of ore deposits that are genetically linked in both time and space, as well as shared tectonic process. And this map shows Earth MRI's focus areas, or areas that may have the potential to host critical mineral resources. And the colors are different mineral systems where these minerals may be found. So this map was generated through close collaboration with the state geological surveys. And I'm showing this because it's the framework we use, that Earth MRI uses to prioritize data collection efforts that we fund. So the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, otherwise known as the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, so I might call it the bill, and I apologize for that, was signed in November 2021 and contained a significant increase to Earth MRI's roughly $10 million annual budget. So starting in fiscal year 2022, the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act provided Earth MRI with $320 million over 5 years to accelerate efforts to carry out the fundamental resources and mapping mission of the USGS. And the language is shown here on this slide. The bill language directed Earth MRI to focus on above ground mineral resources or mine waste, as well as the subsurface. USGS has been involved in mine waste research for quite some time. However, support from this act has certainly allowed Earth MRI to ramp up our efforts in mine waste. So why are we studying mine waste? Well, we know there's a mine waste in every site. The map on the right here, the yellow dots, demonstrates this. Our US Mineral Deposit Database project has digitized mining-related symbols from historic USGS topographic maps and has identified more than 700,000 mine features, of which over 14,000 are mine waste features. This is important because many of these sites pose environmental and physical hazards. Also, reclaiming these mine sites may offer co-benefits for both remediation as well as critical mineral recovery. So essentially, every land management agency at the federal level maintains a database of some sort of legacy mining sites, but there's no authoritative source or national database of mine waste sites or the critical minerals that they might contain. So there's also no systematic assessment for critical minerals in mine waste. So in order to answer the questions of where, what, how much mine waste materials are present, they contain critical or other valuable minerals, we need to know exactly what's out there. So on this next slide, the periodic table shown on the right is shown where the colors illustrate the level that the element is a byproduct or not. So this just shows that many of the critical minerals, including the rare earth elements, are recovered as a result of mining for something else. So these critical minerals that are crucial for today's energy and technology were not extracted in the past. So they might be in mine waste and have the potential to be recovered in the future. Earth MRI will support mapping and collection of information on the locations, volumes, compositions of mine waste across the country. And this includes working with states and other partners to map and gather the data to support both a national mine waste inventory and mine waste characterization efforts. And these will help inform potential critical mineral endowments of non-fuel hard rock mine waste materials and reclamation decisions. And to put our Earth MRI efforts in perspective, this slide summarizes the mine waste efforts and goals within the USGS. Ultimately, USGS investments in data acquisition, research, and model development will build the capacity to conduct national mine waste assessments that will inform decision-making on reprocessing, recovery, reuse, recycling, and reclamation of mine waste. So our Earth MRI efforts are primarily focused on this data collection piece on the left, and this is crucial to the USGS's overall interest in mine waste studies. So as I mentioned earlier, there is no comprehensive nationwide inventory of mine waste and the critical minerals that they may contain. Development of this inventory is supported by the bill funding, and it is an effort that we are moving full speed ahead on right now. And this effort is being led by Jeff Mock and his U.S. mineral deposit database team here at USGS. We envisioned an inventory that will address the major outstanding questions listed here, including how many mine waste piles are there, how much material is available that may contain critical mineral resources, and what are the characteristics of that material, and how does land ownership and other factors influence access to these sites. So the states are going to be very important in helping us populate this inventory, and the inventory will support other state and federal agencies responsible for addressing safety and environmental hazards in areas of legacy mining, and it's crucial to understanding potential sources of many byproduct minerals that are, again, currently critical, but that were previously discarded or overlooked. So in addition to helping support the inventory efforts, Earth MRI is also supporting mine waste characterization work. The ultimate goal of this effort is to estimate the critical mineral endowment of mine waste materials across the country so that we can ultimately provide assessments of critical minerals in mine waste. So the work we're starting now via Earth MRI is the first step toward realizing this greater goal. Another goal is gaining an understanding of the potential mineral hosts of critical minerals and an assessment of the environmental characteristics of the mine waste to better inform potential reprocessing strategies related to environmental management and reclamation. So via these detailed site studies, states can help develop a comprehensive and internally consistent database of mine waste locations, masses, geochemical composition, bulk mineralogical composition, and contained commodities. And a crucial and very early part of this effort is developing mine waste site characterization and sampling protocols. And this will guide the greater effort. And these protocols can ultimately be adapted by decision makers to quantitatively evaluate whether or not mine waste reuse, recycling, or reprocessing for recovery of critical minerals and other commodities are actually viable remediation cleanup alternatives. So the state geological surveys are helping us with the development of these standard protocols. And we kicked off 3 projects last year with the New Mexico Bureau of Geology and Mineral Resources, the Colorado Geological Survey, and the Florida Geological Survey, which will each provide diverse opportunities to help with the development of mine waste sampling protocols. And this will also help guide a more comprehensive program with the states going forward. And lastly, this year we are kicking off a new program in order to more efficiently work with all of the state surveys across the country. And so this program will fund projects focused on populating the inventory and collecting new data for mine waste characterization. The USGS will require that the standard sampling protocols that we are developing are utilized, and we will provide the training to do so. The USGS will also perform a fixed suite of geochemical analyses on collected samples, and this information will also feed the inventory. So we are very hopeful that this opportunity will also expand geoscience workforce through opportunities and collaborations with the state surveys. So this will be an annual opportunity that will be funded through fiscal year 2026. And we do realize that a lot of state level expertise in mine waste may not reside at state geological surveys. So we're encouraging collaboration with other state agencies. And it's my hope that we'll be able to open up this program more widely to other state agencies in future years. So this opportunity is about to hit the streets. So we're really, really looking forward to the launch of this new program. And I think with that, I will end it. And I hope I provided an overview of Earth MRI's mine waste efforts supported by the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. And I look forward to the panel discussion today. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Darcy, for that excellent presentation and overview of the Earth MRI program. I think we have just a couple minutes here for a little bit of back and forth Q&A, just to go a little bit deeper on some of the topics that you discussed. I think one of my first questions just goes to the timing of all of this and the scale, and how long is it really going to take to get all of this done? Right now, you mentioned that you're funded at $320 million over 5 years, and that you're then expected to do the work work in 10 years, we'll be able to have this inventory. If we were to double that amount of money, would you be able to do the work in half the time?
That's a very good question, Abby. and although this is the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act is providing an unprecedented opportunity, and we are collecting, again, an unprecedented amount of data that again, USGS has not seen before at this level. We've only barely skimmed the surface of really the nationwide mapping and the information that we really need. And I think a big bottleneck here is the people and the workforce and the folks that can actually make the data, make it happen, really integrate all this data and really such that we can really learn a lot about our critical mineral potential in the US. And so I think it's a great start. We're really appreciating the opportunity, and we're really growing this into an amazing national mapping program. And again, as I mentioned, these data sets are crucial for so many other applications outside of critical mineral resources. And so I see them being invaluable for all sorts of our science issues. But yeah, I think a big bottleneck here is just actually making sure that we have those future geophysicists and the future geologists and economic geologists that can actually really digest all this data and really make it go with it.
Thanks, Darcy. One other new question. I was wondering is there a preliminary sense for just how much minerals we might be able to get from this existing mine waste? Any kind of guesstimates that are out there? And also, once we've retrieved this data through the Earth MRI program, will that be made publicly available to different stakeholders to use?
Yeah, so I'll start with the second question first. All of our data are made publicly available, and I guess can go and look back at my slide. That first slide had the Earth MRI website, and so we post all of our data and reports via that website. And you could also see where we hope, when plans are made available, where we hope to map in the future, as well as where we've mapped in the past. And so that'll give you a great idea. And all of our data will be made publicly available. I'm sorry, please remind me of that first question.
The first question, yes, just is there an initial guesstimate? Yeah.
Right, exactly. I mean, I think it's gonna vary depending on the mine waste site, the type of mineral commodities, the type of mineral deposit. So I think we're working on that. We definitely have a lot of folks who, again, like I said, looked into not only environmental implications, but also really the resource, the composition of these mine waste sites. But I think until we really get a better understanding of that composition, the geochemistry, what exactly the mineralogy, what's exactly contained in the mine waste, then we'll be able to answer those questions. And I know a lot of other folks and other agencies, including DOE, are also working on exploring extraction and processing areas to see even if these deposits contain critical minerals, can we actually get them out? So so I think we're working on that.
Thank you so much. And then finally, our last question, is there anything that you would like to leave the audience with that they should know about the program, perhaps how they should get involved or how they can partner?
Absolutely, and I threw up our contacts, my contact as well as my colleague Warren Days, the science coordinator of Earth MRI, and we encourage you to reach out to us. Earth MRI is, like I said, a partnership between the USGS and the state geological surveys, but we have partnered with industry, we've partnered with other federal agencies. This isn't just we're looking for areas where we can actually really improve win-wins for data collection. For example, we have work going on in Western Nevada that we're looking into collecting geophysical and LiDAR surveys, looking into lithium, but also geothermal resources. And so we're mapping the country here. And so we're really looking for opportunities to leverage our partnerships and our data collection opportunities. So we really encourage y'all to reach out to us.
Thank you so much again, Darcy, for your time and for that overview. I think following this, we'll pass it back on to Corey and the esteemed panel for their great discussion. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Abby.
All right, thank you, Abby, and thank you, Darcy. It's fascinating, exciting to see this research that really could open the door to the types of reclamation and mineral recovery projects that really could be win-wins. So we'll kick off our discussion with our panelists now. And again, before we do that, if any of the audience have questions, just please put them in the chat box. We may not be able to address all the questions in the time that we have allotted today, but if not, reach out to us, and following the webinar, we're happy to follow up with more information and answers any questions that you might have. So yeah, to start off, maybe we can start on the demand side with you, Dan. And yeah, just thinking about Rivian being known for its environmentally friendly products and services, how does this ethos translate into its upstream supply?
Yeah, thank you so much, Corey, for including Rivian on this panel. I'm excited to represent the company alongside the other panelists. And, just for those of you who maybe haven't heard of our company, we're a bit newer. We're an independent U.S. manufacturer of all-electric pickup trucks, SUVs, and vans. And in late 2021, we brought the first all-electric pickup truck to market, which actually became the 2022 Motor Trend Truck of the Year. We also have SUVs based on the same platform and delivery vans. And we're making all these vehicles out of our plant in the town of Normal in central Illinois. The plant itself is a brownfield site. It used to be a Mitsubishi plant from the 1980s. We purchased it in 2017, invested billions to upgrade and expand it, and have about 7,000 people working there now. So it's an exciting clean energy manufacturing story to tell, and it's happening in America's heartland. And I think a similar story could be told about not just abandoned automotive plants, but abandoned mines as well. But that's just a quick overview. To answer your question, we at Rivian recognize the impacts of our supply chain across various indicators of social and environmental responsibility. And we're continuing to advance our sourcing program to be based on key principles like material traceability and mapping, environmental impact reduction, human rights, innovation, and transparency. So we need to address all those components of our sourcing framework to achieve our mission as the company grows. And we recognize that we are both a large end user of critical minerals and a brand that is built on a foundation of sustainability. So we're right in the middle of this conversation. The company wants to be an industry leader on sustainability. My presence here today on this panel reflects that desire. But in addition to our internal sustainability efforts, we have started to engage on policies affecting upstream sourcing as well. We went on record last year in support of domestic mining reform with broad themes like the global mineral race should not be a race to the bottom. I think we can all agree to that. The U.S. should strengthen and secure its domestic mineral supply chain, but not at the expense of special places and our bedrock environmental laws. We could have the safest and cleanest mines here in the United States, thanks to our high standards. And if you look at other countries like Australia and Canada, who have modern mining laws, they still have robust mining sectors, just to push back against the argument that, updating the mining laws could hurt the mining industry. We're also looking to support land and water conservation more generally. We're setting up a foundation. We've begun to take public stances on various conservation efforts, including signing the moratorium on deep sea mining and supporting national monument designations and other protections like the Tongass National Forest roadless rule.
All right. Well, thanks, Dan. A big announcement yesterday on the Tongass roadless rule, since you mentioned it. Good stuff. Appreciate your work and what Rivian's doing there. follow-up question is just from a manufacturing perspective, are there emerging technologies that could help reduce demand for certain minerals, such as, for cobalt, for instance, reducing the reliance on that mineral in particular?
Yes. Yeah, many companies are looking at alternative chemistries that reduce or eliminate the need for cobalt in the battery. A lot of you may have heard of lithium iron phosphate batteries. That seems to be kind of the next nearest promising alternative chemistry. And also, this may sound a little counterintuitive, but electric vehicles themselves are the emerging technology. High demand for EVs will drive innovation throughout the supply chain. So keeping demand high and consumer access open will allow US companies like Rivian to grow and therefore innovate faster. So I just wanted to put a plug here for the consumer side of things. Removing unnecessary barriers to consumer EV adoption is a big piece of this conversation. Getting these vehicles to consumers, making sure their experience is better than we know it now, and I'm talking about the car buying experience, that's the central driver to making these vehicles better. The more we restrict consumer access to domestic EVs, the more we cede leadership in the global auto industry to other countries and offshore our pollution to places with weaker environmental and labor standards. So I hope those are helpful examples.
No, that's great. I really appreciate that perspective, Dan. Thank you. Why don't we turn to Stephen Esposito with Regeneration. Regeneration's mission is to transform legacy mine sites, which sometimes include abandoned mines and ecological assets, while producing critically needed minerals from these sites. Maybe before I jump into the question, Steve, if you want to just maybe offer a couple words about yourself and Regeneration.
Sure. Thanks for having me, Corey and Abby. I'm the founder and CEO of Regeneration, which is a startup mining company. I have a background in environmental policy and advocacy, where I've spent most of my career, including working on mining law reform in the US. Just as in a nutshell, Regeneration is three things. We're a re-mining company. The mining industry's legacy sites and brownfield sites are our potential asset, number one. Number two, we're a technology we have to watch technology and use technology that other people are developing, because there's a lot of innovation going on. So we try to apply the right new technology to the right legacy mine site. And thirdly, we're a restoration company, because our view is that if we're going to accelerate access to critical minerals in the US and around the world, it's critical to also accelerate the social license around those sites. So that's essentially what we are. And fundamentally, we're also, Corey, a public benefit company. We're a B Corp. And that's because we think an innovation in structure is needed to actually get this kick-started.
That's great. Well, thank you. Appreciate you joining us today. First question I had was, I know you have a long history in kind of the mining policy arena, and was curious from your perspective what the biggest federal policy hurdles are facing companies like Regeneration who want to remine and clean up legacy sites in the United States, and what are opportunities to innovate, partner with agencies, and create incentives for full value mining?
Yeah, maybe I'd like to pull back slightly on that and just make a case that we're really talking about three targets, right? And there's policy innovation and regulatory innovation that could help all three of those targets. And one is the orphan site, legacy orphan mines, which we've been talking about. And the second is the closure portfolios of existing active mining companies, those that are sitting, inactive, but in somebody's portfolio And the third are the tailings that are at active mines, right? All three of those are targets, and they're important targets. And so if you widen that lens that way, you see a little more out there and a little more potential. And then from the point of view of policy reform and innovation and regulation, I just offer a few comments, Corey. One is, I don't think anybody on this panel wants to lower any requirement for anything to do with environment or communities. I think the critical thing is how to think differently about this opportunity and make some adjustments. So I'll give one example that I think, Corey, having done a bunch of work on stream habitat, you're quite familiar with, and that's, you mentioned the Good Samaritan provision, where you've tried to limit it, has gone in and done stream habitat improvement work where there are old mine tailings. We want to add a new feature to that. I think you do too, and many of us do, which is we should be able to remine the resource, to pull out the remnant mineral, especially if we're going to use that to offset the cost of the improvement, right? Of the restoration that you guys do so well. I mean, I can envision a number of streams where we could be working together. And what that allows us to do is go into bigger sites, right? to get more resource and to get more positive restoration impact. So that's one example of reform or innovation that would really help us. Another is what the government's already doing, which is the survey. But it might also be interesting to think about how to incentivize claims holders to bring those legacy sites to the party, right? So they're hard to find. It's one thing to do global or US-wide research survey. The part of what we're doing is we're out there scouting for sites. It'd be really interesting to think about how to incentivize that. And while we're at it, let's incentivize downstream to target their supply chain on the remined and restored minerals. So, what a great offer for a Rivian to be able to source its lithium or its cobalt or even its copper from one of these remined sites. The site gets restored and cleaned up, and the company gets to see the benefit in that community, whether it's in the form of a credit or just a really good, community result. So those are the kinds of innovations we think we should be pursuing, and that the US should frankly be leading.
No, thanks. That's some fabulous information. Really glad you mentioned too the opportunities for, the reprocessing and potentially being able to plow those profits back into the ground to fund restoration work. We talked about our new abandoned hard rock mine fund. Yeah.
Just to add to that, I mean, we're all for a pure commercial effort to go at these minerals and waste, but we think the beginning of this actually gets assisted. That's why we put Regeneration together as a public benefit company, just to get out there and start doing this work, this critically important work. It's assisted by this kind of public benefit structure where you can take the proceeds, if you will, and bring them back to the land and the communities.
Yeah, that's fantastic. The next question I had was, we've kind of talked about there not being any silver bullets to these supply chain challenges for critical minerals. But, this can be part of a solution. And so I was just kind of curious from your perspective, how much potential is there for, legacy mine sites, be it the orphan sites, be it the sites that are inactive, be it current, sites, as you said, with tailing piles existing. Within those three buckets, how much potential do you think there are for these types of sites to help meet the increase in demand, and how can that fit into supply chain strategy?
Yeah, I think it's important to note that, it's clearly in our interest to get as much access to and mineral out of these sites as possible. But it's got to be an all of the above solution, right? Just like with recycling, right? So post-consumer recycling is important, but it's going to take a while with certain minerals and certain products for that to really kick up. And it's always going to be a portion of the solution. This is a portion of the solution, right? I don't have a number. I think it has the potential to co-equal recycling targets, if not exceed them. I mean, that's the way we see it. I think it has the potential, Corey and others, to start a little sooner, especially if we can do some pilot testing at these sites, like what was proposed in the Ban the Mine Reform Act, where you could start some pilot testing. Because we can, once we start showing what's possible, we think there'll be a bit of a push and an incentive, and especially if we can widen this lens to include, go beyond orphan sites and abandoned sites. So we think the potential is significant. We also think it has the potential to kind of get some activity going, right? And I think what will happen is once communities start to see the dual benefit of the remining, the extraction of the metal, and the restoration, it'll switch from being kind of this new thing that hasn't happened much before to communities, states really wanting to develop these projects. And so our sense is it has some real good potential and some real significant potential, especially in what is this transition phase as we see it.
Oh, that's really good. I was excited listening to you, and like I liken it to the Mark Twain whitewashing the fence, and let's get everybody out there.
Yep.
Why don't we we can move along to Kevin with BHP. I feel like industry does have an essential role to play in both cleaning up the past and supplying minerals for the future. So I'm really curious to hear your perspective on all this, and offer you the opportunity as well to maybe tell us a little bit about yourself and the work BHP is doing.
Yeah, thanks. At a high level, BHP is a leading international mining company, and we've structured the focus of our business to be around supplying the resources the world needs to grow and decarbonize. So that's kind of the business focus has been around providing copper for renewable energy, nickel for electric vehicles, potash for sustainable farming, and iron in particular for the steel and infrastructure that helps support that energy transition. So as a broad company level, we're around 80,000 employees and contractors, and we work across somewhere in the order of 90 different locations around the world. Our specific group, Legacy Assets, is a team that BHP has established to manage sites that are former mining sites within mostly North America and a few sites that we have in some other jurisdictions. And our purpose is to reimagine the legacy of mining. So we're really driven towards looking at how we can provide the best stewardship outcomes for sites, which may include repurposing, may include reprocessing, or may have some other alternative outcomes. But we're particularly keenly interested in opportunities for reprocessing and coming up with improvements on the way we manage and handle mine sites after their initial or historic mining operations have ceased production.
All right. I guess just my first question, and maybe this piggybacks a little bit on the conversation with Steve there, but with hundreds of thousands of abandoned mines in the U.S., it would appear that there should be ample opportunities to produce minerals while reclaiming sites. I'm curious, are there specific conditions that limit the feasibility on many of these sites? Or could these practices be widely applied if the right policy levers were in place?
Yeah, I think that's a challenging one, because I think there are a number of issues. I think at a high level, there's probably a couple that I would touch on. I think the first issue is really around, are there sufficient grades of a desirable mineral present to allow for an economic recovery? So your commodities are going to be driven by a market valuation, and that's not unique to brownfield sites, but it's also really is one of the frequent impediments to look at remining. When you look at remining, as a lot of the sites can be older, a lot of the infrastructure has frequently been removed, and so you have the same large capital costs or similar large capital costs to bring a site back into production. But that mineral present in sufficient quantity is definitely a key parameter. And I think that's what's one of the really great things about what Darcy was talking about earlier. One of the really neat things around that program is unlocking some knowledge around something that that could help facilitate re-examination around some of these large deposits. I think another challenge, though, is potentials, environmental obligations associated with the legacy, orphaned, and abandoned sites. So in many instances, we know historical operations didn't necessarily operate to the same standards that we would hope and expect today. And those could have resulted in both known and unknown environmental impacts. So in many US jurisdictions, the environmental liability scheme is joint and several and quite stringent. Even in other jurisdictions where there are alternate liability schemes, you still have challenges around redevelopment, because a frequent redevelopment process might involve a different company doing the redevelopment than did the original mining. And in circumstances where you have joint and several liability and potentially commingling of waste products, and it's sometimes hard to distinguish impacts from a historic operation to a present operation, that can be challenging for a redevelopment or reprocessing enterprise to make sense economically. And that raises a lot of complexity around the questions of environmental diligence and risk and economics and the appropriate financial assurance mechanisms that would be in place. I think all of those pieces together make that sometimes brownfield sites not quite as straightforward or linear as they might initially seem, even if there is some valuable mineral quantities present at the site. And I think there are some redevelopment programs, but policy mechanisms that could help facilitate the liability management for companies around historic mines, and the redevelopment probably would be fruitful in enhancing the ability for some of the brownfield redevelopment.
Okay, so yeah, certainly some challenges out there. With the work BHP's done with legacy work in Arizona, I was curious if you could speak to some specific case studies and what hurdles BHP is working to overcome to steward those sites. Yeah, for sure. So as I mentioned, with our legacy assets, our primary goal is to achieve safe, stable, and non-polluting. So any of the sites that we're stewarding has the sort of minimum benchmark that they have to achieve. We do think that reprocessing can play a really good role at some of those sites to achieve those aims. So align with the primary goal of managing these former mine sites, while also providing enhanced outcomes for the site. We are examining right now, actually, opportunity looking at tailings reprocessing. We have an area where tailings were generated quite a long time ago, in some cases even more than 100 years ago. And the recovery technologies that were in place at the time were not as good as the technologies that we have available now. And as Darcy had mentioned, not necessarily were all of the same mineral constituents the target of those recovery efforts when the material was first recovered, processed, and run through that mining and milling process. Some of the challenges that we have been facing and we're still working through, so these are hurdles that we're clearing and still working on, relate to things around quantities and infrastructure. So in this particular instance, we see really favorable grades. So there's sufficient concentrations of valuable minerals in there to warrant reprocessing. But the volumes sometimes are smaller, because older mine sites are were generally completed at a smaller size scale than some of the more modern mining enterprises. And so there is a challenge to get around what the capital cost of installing the
equipment in place to do a reprocessing job on a relatively small amount of tailings. Now, on this one, we've also been working with the fact that in the area there are other operators who have mineral processing facilities that could potentially be deployed for that purpose. But that's leading to some of the other challenges that I kind of mentioned earlier about commingling of wastes and how do you manage liabilities between disparate parties in those in pursuing those opportunities that at a high level, I think, you know, almost everybody would agree makes very good sense. But on the level of being a steward for each of the enterprises that are involved, there can be some difficulty in making sure that mutually appropriate agreements that are also satisfactory to the appropriate agencies are also met. So we're still actually working through that. We're quite optimistic in this case that we are going to come to an effective outcome. And that might be a little bit of a platform for us. That would be one of the first instances where we've had substantial modern reprocessing undertaken in the United States.
Okay, wow. So it could really serve as a jumping off point.
Yeah.
You know, why don't we go ahead and get some questions here from the chat. You know, one question, I think maybe it was for Darcy, but it was from David Wu. How can private sector get involved and help with the process? I think in reference to the, you know, the inventory.
Thank you for that question. Again, we've worked very closely with industry and the private sector on our mapping campaigns. In terms of developing our inventory, I think, you know, I would just welcome you to reach out. We don't have a specific funding program for that goes outside of the state agencies, but I would just encourage you to reach out to me and the USGS crew, and we can do our best to sort of work together and figure out opportunities where we can collaborate.
Thank you. And a follow-up to that question from Ann Mace is, how will USGS MRI adapt when the new list of critical minerals come out every 3 years as required by the infrastructure law?
Well, that's a great question, and of course, Earth MRI started in 2019. So our focus on critical minerals is based on the 2018 critical minerals list. Of course, the new list was published last year, and the focus area map that I showed in my talk was really targeting looking at mineral systems where they have the potential for containing all 50 of the critical minerals in the 2022 list. And again, that's something that's going to be, we will evolve. I mean, the critical minerals will change, you know, so we're and a lot of Earth MRI's mapping efforts, although the focus is critical minerals, we're looking at mineral resources on a greater level. And so a lot of our work will, you know, encompasses other mineral resources, not just the critical minerals one. And so a lot of our mapping priorities in the areas where we're working are valuable beyond just the critical minerals. And so to be honest, I don't think our focus area maps would change that much with different small changes on that list.
Okay, thank you. That's helpful. You know, another question wasn't directed at any panelists in particular, but maybe Kevin, maybe it's something that you'd want to kind of piggybacks on what you were just talking about, actually. But like, what role should communities play in reclaiming mine sites, and should they be able to advise companies to come and clean up their abandoned mines?
Yeah, I think it's an interesting thing because there's a whole set of different mine terminology that are sometimes used without necessarily a clean distinction between the categories of mines that we have present. So there's orphaned and abandoned mines is quite distinct from legacy mines, where there's there is a descendant company that is still involved with the stewardship of that property. And I think, as Darcy had laid out on that map, you know, that huge listing of mines across the United States, a large number of those mines might have been mined by an enterprise in 1913 to 1917, and there was no entity. You know, maybe the entity folded up and disappeared at the end of that enterprise, and so those end up sitting in difficult circumstances, and it's been challenges for a lot of regions to find nice ways to come to suitable environmental outcomes. I mean, there's been some amazing work in the States. Montana, I think, has been doing some really great work around addressing some of those legacy, orphaned and abandoned mine sites. Conversely, there's a number of sites, as in the case of the mines that BHP manages, where the companies are still there and responsibly stewarding the project sites. And it's very important when we work in an area, we consider the community to be a partner and stakeholder in every aspect of how we operate, how we close, how we do remediation, and if there's any subsequent redevelopment. So, I mean, broadly, I would say the community always has to have an important say and buy-in with respect to who they engage in. And who they engage with. It's a lot better to have situations such as BHP's, where there's a responsible party present to have those conversations and deploy those resources and have that progression towards a reclamation or a repurposed site. Unfortunately, that is not always the case across the historic sites that took place quite a while ago, and that, I think, would be broadly facilitated by those policy levers that I was talking about earlier. And I think Regeneration probably would have some comments around that too, is that in some cases, there might be a abandoned site that has reasonable mineral prospects that could be reprocessed and remediated all at the same time. But companies might be apprehensive about wading their toes into that area when there's a legacy of impacts that there's not a responsible party to address that with.
Yeah, and can I come in there, Corey? Because I think that,
Please.
I mean, I would recommend that as a kind of policy and a regulatory strategy and a community strategy. Well, I would answer the question by saying yes, communities should be able to recommend sites for restoration and for remining and restoration, right? And then the question is to whom, right? And then what, and kind of in what context. So I think a lot of these sites occur, like minerals are in a pattern geologically. I'm not a geologist. So are the solutions for remining and restoration. So BHP itself may not be able to solve, hopefully it can solve its closure opportunity, but there are others nearby. We need to kind of think a little differently about those sites and those locations and do things like create incentives for a restoration plan, a remining plan and vision that cuts across boundaries, because the fish swim across those boundaries and people live across those boundaries, right? That may be associated with some opportunity to kind of share opportunity and risk across the players involved without putting an environmental risk or liability on the community, right? So I think there's some interesting innovation and some opportunity for shared infrastructure, right? We know of technologies that are very mobile that could come back in. Why wouldn't we take them from one site to another, whether it's BHP's to one that's abandoned, to one that an agency has in its portfolio and wants a solution to? We just need to think a little bit differently with a slightly wider view of the community. And I think some opportunities will open up, and then you can see some ways to take the liability issue. I don't want to let BHP off the hook. I don't think BHP is asking to be let off the hook, quite the contrary. But let's take that risk at a wider scale and solve it.
Absolutely.
No, thanks for that addition there, Stephen. Maybe a follow-up on that actually to you. One of the questions we had come in was if someone can address concerns associated with going in and reclaiming abandoned mine sites, and what can be done to mitigate those concerns, if that's something you'd like to address, Steve.
Sure. I mean, there are some sites where we should just leave it alone. There's been some, certain things are no longer exposed. The situation, there may be minerals that are significant, but it may not be the wisest thing to go in. So I don't think anybody's sitting here saying, let's go everywhere, right? I think the issue, especially when you have legacy environmental impacts, community eyesores, and critical minerals, that maybe is the trifecta, right? So I think that is important to make sure we kind of take the right approach and pick the right targets. As you pointed out earlier, Corey, the environment's pretty target rich. I don't think in the early days there'll be a shortage of those opportunities.
Yeah. Okay, thanks. Question for you, Dan, that came in from Aaron. Does the Inflation Reduction Act's 10% tax credit for critical minerals help with remining economics?
I believe it does. Rivian right now is not producing their own batteries. We have a third-party supplier, but I would say in general, you know, not just I think they're talking about the 45X PTC, not just for batteries, but for many different types of clean energy components. Yes, that's an exciting provision that actually wasn't in previous iterations of the Inflation Reduction Act or the Reconciliation Bill, Build Back Better, whatever you want to call it. I know that bill was negotiated for a long time, over 2 years, more than that probably. But to answer the question, yes, I would say that's a helpful provision. Zooming out a little bit, you know, looking at the broader bill, really incredible what happened last year during the last Congress to push the largest climate bill in US history through a 50-50 Senate on strictly partisan lines. It was incredibly high political drama, if you ask me. I will comment, you know, a little bit on the EV tax credits. There were a lot of restrictions on the consumer EV tax credit, some of which were I don't think favorable to US-based companies in the near term. Although I personally I agree with you know, Senator Manchin's sentiment in securing our supply chain. So you know, it was a bit of a mixed bag for Rivian, frankly. We were pleased to see 45X, 48C is another one that was in the package. The new 45W commercial EV tax credit is brand new and a big opportunity for driving demand. As I said earlier, you know, these are great examples of policy tools that spur demand for the products in ways that will ultimately drive innovation in that space. So, you know, overall, we're very pleased to see what happened in the IRA, and we hope subsequent Congresses can build on that progress.
Okay, thanks. Appreciate that, Dan. The question that we had from Kwame, speaking to the difficulties we've seen with ultimately taxpayers having to be a backstop for reclamation when things haven't gone wrong in the past. Looking forward, how do we ensure that policy changes to encourage remining do not leave taxpayers holding the bag into the future? Maybe that's something that you want to address, Steve?
Sure. I think a few things. One is, you know, the legacy impacts from abandoned and orphan mines are sitting out there with no incentive really to address them. So, and what this really does, or what we should be doing, is incentivizing that on the one hand, and then on the risk side related to remining, you know, a tailings pile, waste rock, coming at it again. The same, you know, for an organization or a company like ours, the issue really is going into a site with the past liability is the problem. There's no problem whatsoever going into a site, taking on liability for what we do. You know, taking account of, you know, Kevin's point that sometimes there's a little bit of a fuzz there in the middle about exactly how that situates as you start reprocessing. But I think there are ways to do that, right? I think there are ways to make sure that's the case. And then what we would want to do is make sure that, you know, any future activity had a sufficient bond or sufficient reclamation plan. And then we go a step further and we say restoration. We don't just mean what the BLM requires on federal land, for example. We mean what really turns that stream back into a safe location to go fish for trout, and like the work you're doing, Corey. So that, I think that the model, we recommend the model that incentivizes going that step further, and then, you know, that liability for that site gets brought down as we make those improvements. But I think the record of current bonding, you know, attached to, you know, the most recent mining is a pretty good record. And I think that will just continue to improve. So we just take it where it is and we go further and we add the restoration piece, which I think it's really important, not just from a risk point of view, but from a community social license point of view, frankly.
No, exactly.
And then Kevin may want to come in on that as well.
Yeah, I might add a couple thoughts, because I think what Stephen was saying is exactly right about some components. You know, for going in with a greenfield development, there's actually a very nice mechanism in place that holds in most jurisdictions within the United States, and I would say most Western countries around the world, that holds companies accountable for those liabilities to make sure that taxpayers don't end up footing the bill on those. Some of the challenges come in when developments are happening on brownfield sites, and in particular where the original disturbance took place as the result of some other entity's action. So around the world, there's a number of examples. You know, you can test some really old ones. The Rio Tinto River in Spain was called that river because the Romans started mining there, you know, somewhere in the order of 2,000 years ago, and led to some riverine contamination that continued up till present day. And there's been some really effective work at mining there that has actually also improved fish habitat. And I think just a couple of years ago, some of the first time that there's been migratory fish up through a segment of that river in just about 2,000 years, which is a pretty remarkable outcome. There's some instances in northern Canada as well where governments have facilitated how to take a historical brownfield site and enable an enterprise to come in and do reprocessing and reclamation at the same time, while being shielded from some of the potential risks that came from a prior contamination. But those are hard. They're difficult questions, and I think that that's sometimes where looking at that bigger picture that Stephen was talking about in regions, because he's exactly right. Typically, if one mine is located here, then there's probably one nearby it, and maybe some have accountable parties still present and some don't. But looking at the legislative mechanisms to say, how can you encourage enterprises to go in and do work in an area where it's going to enhance and improve the environmental conditions, I think would be quite beneficial.
Yeah, and I'd like to come in just to follow up on one thing on that, which is in the comments to the Interagency Working Group Task Force on Mining Law Reform, one of our recommendations as it related to Good Samaritan was this: pilots make a lot of sense, right? The important thing is to ensure that any remining comes in with a proposal for reclamation. We shouldn't just be going in, you know, and kind of sampling the tailings and figuring out what's in there and is it economical. We should be going in and developing a reclamation strategy and plan that shows what can happen when remining is done well in tandem. To us, that combination is what gets you over. I mean, it doesn't take the liability away. You still need bonding, right? Absolutely. But it gives you that shared planning effort that I think will reassure communities that the end result can improve, to some of the examples Kevin was using.
Yeah, I love it. The idea of restoring ecological function and getting those fish swimming back up those streams after 2,000 years, Kevin. It's definitely something Trout Unlimited is all about. Well, I think we have just about time for you know, maybe one more discussion topic here. You know, coming from Ty and Travis asking about the EPA operating numerous wastewater treatment plants at Superfund sites, removing metals from water at former mine sites. And the question being, is there a similar opportunity to reclaim metals from wastewater as there is in reprocessing solids waste, and if there are regulatory hurdles associated with that? And I know that, on the coal side of things, there's been funding recently for to go do more research into that. Like, can we get rare earths out of this coal mine waste? And so I think the question is, can we be doing something similar with hard rock mine waste? I don't know if anybody wants to take that on.
I mean, I'll comment from BHP's perspective. We certainly as a company spend a lot of time and resources thinking about how you can improve wastewater treatment. In certain instances, a lot around the mineralogies, a lot of these hard rock deposits are sulfidic deposits, and they have the potential to have a water management challenge that might last for quite a long time, decades, and in some cases hundreds of years. And so any opportunities to make sure that those constituents are removed and used to a productive purpose, as opposed to just removed and stockpiled as a waste product, is certainly desirable. I think that's a technology challenge in a lot of cases, more than a policy challenge, in that there's a lot of innovation taking place, and I think there's a lot of really neat things being done around recovering constituents. But when the concentrations are quite low, when you move 1 million gallons of water through a system and can only pull out a couple ounces of a particular compound, you just need a very clever approach in order to make that economically feasible.
Yeah, and I would just add to that, we've assigned one of our team members just to look just at that, and to have the knowledge of all the innovations, and it's happening very quickly and it's accelerating, that are in play. And then, so we do see those opportunities for water, extracting metals from water, putting them to good use in products, and treating the water and cleaning it up. So we should get everything out we can. And then the question is our question is which sites to start doing that at, that would serve as good examples, maybe in a small sense of what can be done, and then maybe combine those with some of what companies are already doing, mining companies are already doing. I think there's a bit of a story to be told there. And there's a lot of innovators trying to get access to water, to wastewater, that can't because of liability issues, and because larger companies have a hard time navigating all that's going on in the innovation space. So a little bit of a brokering role would go a long way. I think government can play a role there, frankly.
Yeah, I'll just tack onto this too. I may sound like a broken record, but again, rising demand for EVs helps raise the price of these minerals, and the price of those minerals then makes the incentive for processors and reminers to go after these new techniques. So this is exactly the type of innovation I was talking about that can be driven by maintaining high demand for electric vehicles.
All right. Well, thanks everyone, and thanks Dan for kind of tying it all together for us, the upstream, downstream, and in between. I think we're about up with the time that we have allotted here today. And as we said, we didn't have an opportunity to get to all the questions, so please do follow up with additional questions and information. We'll be happy to provide it. I don't know, Abby, if you had anything you wanted to say before we wrap things up here.
I just wanted to say thank you so much to our panelists, to Darcy, Dan, Kevin, Stephen, and to you, Corey, for leading such an engaging discussion. I believe on the final, leave behind slide, there'll be some contact information for people who want to shoot us those questions to have our panelists perhaps respond later. But thank you again for the time, and everyone should keep mine waste in mind as one of the potential ways to reach our critical mineral goals. Thank you so much.
All right.